Today, my guest is Rich Edwards. He is a product manager at IBM. Welcome, Rich. Tell us a little more about the products that you're working on at IBM.
Well, first of all, thanks, Felix. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. I've been with IBM for 10 years, and I'm currently working on the IBM Watson group around the developer cloud offering. And these are the services that we're making available to individual developers, in a platform as a service offering around some of the componentized technology that we have around the IBM Watson system. So you may have seen some of the things, in the TV commercials, or certainly the Jeopardy challenge a couple of years ago.
Mhm.
We're trying to enable largely independent software vendors and startups and other people who are just generally want to tinker around with it, the ability to use some of the individual component technologies and build on top of it.
Yeah, it's some very cool stuff. I think that there's a lot of innovation in that space. So it's really awesome to see or to have you on and to talk about that.
Sure.
I was looking at your LinkedIn and the different jobs you've had in the past, and you weren't always working as a product manager. You kind of did different things at different companies. Can you tell us a little more about your past and what drove you towards product management?
Sure. Going all the way back to undergrad, I had an engineering undergraduate degree, and I went to school on a Army scholarship. So I did ROTC when I was in college, and then I went in the Army as an engineer officer after that, and did that for 4 years, and decided I was going to get married to my then girlfriend. And she was in graduate school, and so we said, okay, time to her to leave graduate school and me to leave the Army, and we ended up moving to North Carolina, and I started working for Alcatel, for a subsidiary of Alcatel called Burktech, making fiber optic cable, which is a rather large industry specific to North Carolina. And worked there for a couple of years, and very much like operationally focused. It was manufacturing. And I really wanted to get into either a marketing or sales role. And one of the opportunities to do that was to go back to school. And so I went and got my MBA from UNC, Chapel Hill, from their executive MBA program, and kind of did that at nights and weekends while I was still working in the plant. And when I was done with that, was really, that was the impetus for me to make this change into, a more marketing role. And I ended up going to work for IBM, actually hired by a classmate of mine from grad school. And I worked in a role that was kind of half finance, half marketing in services. And this was in a business that was selling hardware. And we had a services practice, so this was kind of like the last mile of configuration and installation work. And it was largely around some of the new technology that was coming out at the time. And it was really interesting and really got my interest, particularly in product management, because I worked with a lot of product managers because we were trying to figure out how do we have this new technology that's coming out that there isn't a lot of knowledge around, particularly how to use it or how to get the most out of it in the market, and trying to close that gap and really turning the experience we were getting working with customers and seeing how they were using it and turning that into requirements that were showing up in the product roadmap. And I thought that was really interesting, and so I started looking for a role to go do that. And I got the opportunity to move over to IBM Software Group, and I worked in the data center automation group for a while, doing general strategy, doing a lot of analyst work, a lot of allocation from a investment standpoint, some things around M&A. It was really, really interesting work. And then had the chance to go into a business unit and actually get involved in owning a product and moving it, dealing with shipping a product and taking it all the way from concept through development, into what was then a adoption of agile development in IBM, and particularly in the software business, and delivering that. And that was really, really interesting work. And after a couple of years of doing that, I had an opportunity to go work for this brand new business unit that IBM was considering forming, and it was specifically around the Watson technology and the work that had come out of IBM research after the Jeopardy Grand Challenge, and they began to think about how do we commercialize that. And they had spent a lot of time just fielding, as you could imagine, a lot of rather interesting proposals and ideas from the market, and the preponderance of them came from the healthcare market. So that kind of led the initial strategy and the initial work around developing Watson-based solutions in healthcare. The one that gets the most attention is Watson for Oncology, and that was through a partnership with several hospitals and institutions. And it's really pretty impressive, is this kind of idea about taking things based on some existing technology and machine learning and natural language processing, and really advancing the state of the art, where you can think of some of the solutions as like the world's greatest research assistant that kind of follows you around all day and doesn't really make decisions for you, but makes really, really good recommendations and things that you might have thought of. And certainly in a domain like medicine, where the volume of research, even within a fairly narrow specialization, is so large that no one person can consume it all. It's really, really impressive to see some of the things that can be done, and certainly an area that has such a big impact on it. So, I jumped at that. That was just a great opportunity to jump over there and work on that. And so I've been doing that for the past year, just about since we launched the Watson business unit as a kind of an independent business unit within IBM, and started working on the developer cloud. And this was a very different market from where I had been before, where I previously been working largely in the enterprise space, working with very large data centers, particularly high volume transaction business, and shifting over into a space that was largely servicing independent developers. So the persona, the individual users we were working with, very different. It was a very different business model, where it had been the delivery of traditional software into now cloud services. Trying to figure out how are we going to do that with a rather unique piece of technology, and being able to break that down in a way that made sense both for how we were building these larger solutions that we would build privately or with IBM's brand name on them, but also individually for customers that were interested in building individual applications.
Yeah, yeah. So as you're talking about this, it sounds like a lot of your job has been finding technology that already exists or has already been developed and looking for business use for it. And given your background in both having an engineering undergrad and then getting an MBA, do you find that product management can be highly technical where you do need to come up with a tech, or is it more of like a marketing kind of a marketing like operation or marketing role where you're going out and looking for these like markets or finding business cases or business uses for existing technology?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and the way I would answer that is it very much depends on the type of organization you're in. And not only like big business, small business, but also where are they in the life cycle? Is it early on? Is it later on? And one of the best ways to figure out like what type of role you're in is to look at ratios of things like how many product managers are there per engineer, because that's pretty descriptive about what the scope of the role is. I want to say it was Ian McAllister from Amazon had a pretty good breakdown on this and had some interesting benchmarks. So on the lower end, if I remember, very technical, very close to what's going on, much more feature function related would be Microsoft from an enterprise standpoint. And I want to say the ratio was something around 3 or 4 engineers per product manager. So you kind of see the reach of how far are you going from people who are actually writing code. What's your relationship to those? How close are you? And you can look on the higher end around where the role is going to be much more strategic, is going to be something over 10. And that's the type of role where you're one step back and you're not looking at things from, say, an individual sprint standpoint or an individual feature standpoint. It's going to be more let me think of the high level strategy of really more at the individual problem that we're solving for customers, and to use the agile terminology, you live at the epic level, in that type of environment. So it's a lot about the type of company, where you are in your life cycle, and certainly how the what your organizational looks like.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it seems like, when you were trying to get your, not that maybe you weren't necessarily trying to get a product manager role, but once you got to one and you're looking back on your career path, it seems like you were inching closer and closer to product by doing things, or, being involved in more projects, or working with more departments that were more and more related to product management. Do you find that that is a typical career path for somebody that wants to get into product? Is that they see kind of, or maybe have this kind of drive towards being more hands-on and
Mm-hmm.
being more involved in the development of the product, and then just kind of trying to find more roles that move them closer and closer to that role?
So, a lot of questions I get sometimes, being a manager of product managers, where I'm part of the role is hiring product managers, is what's the career path that gets you there? And I never have one straight answer for that. And the reason is that, you look at the domain of everything that you need to do as a discipline of product management, and it's fairly broad enough that you never see one person totally cover it. They may be able to cover it for a while, or they may be able to cover it during a certain life stage. But when you think of it as, there's an element of technical expertise and really understanding the technology of what you're doing, um, plus understanding the market that you work in, and the individual customers you're dealing with, and then understanding maybe the specific domain of within that market that you're serving, um, you know, that's a pretty broad, diverse set of skills, set of understanding, set of experience that type of role demands. And so, I look at it as you're usually building a team of two or three people that are overlapping sometimes in what they're doing. If not individual products, then certainly responsibilities for the entire business. And to that end, you end up hiring people with different backgrounds. So if I look at my team now and the teams that I've managed in the past, it's a pretty diverse group. You have people who have come in from very technical roles, either developers or architects or product service or support standpoint. People who come in from a more straight marketing background, who would not be comfortable doing things from a command line or writing code, but really understand the market and maybe how we go to market and can talk to the individual customers. And then you have people who are actually customers. I've done that once or twice with some pretty good success, of people who had been users of your product and have come in that way. Each one of them had their own strengths, and certainly came at it from a different way. So, that's one of those angles of, you should never feel, well, I only have technical experience. I don't have any sales experience, so I can't be a product manager. And that's certainly not the case. It's certainly not the case the other way. And that it's really a fit for what the organization needs at that time to help move the product along and keep it relevant
Yeah.
in the market.
Yeah, and speaking about getting that job and preparing for, or depending on what kind of skill sets the company's looking for, what do you find is kind of the most important skills to have as a product manager? What kind of skills do you think are most in demand right now for companies that are hiring product managers?
So, um, so the way to answer that is to think about what product management does, and why product management is, as a discipline, is important to an organization. Um, and when you think of product delivery, there's really kind of three main disciplines. And this goes back to kind of the thinking around like design thinking, right? And you have technical development roles that are really geared towards feasibility. Can we do what's being asked of us, and can we deliver it? And then there's design and design thinking, where you start thinking about it from a user experience standpoint. And is the thing that we're delivering, is it desirable? Is it a pleasurable experience working with our product? And then you have product management, who's really about differentiation. Are we doing something that's important to the market, and are we going to remain relevant to them, not just with this release, but the next release and the release after that? Are we staying on a path that's going to keep us, essential to our customers, or are we going down a path where they could probably pick from 5 or 6 different competitors and it wouldn't really matter? That's really where you're going to add value as a product manager. So to that end, really one of the most important skills you can have is being able to understand the market that you serve, being able to understand your customers, really having true empathy for them and the problems they deal with. Because you find that a lot of times, while your day-to-day and what you focus on is about solving a rather well-defined technical problem, in the eyes of the customer, the problem you're solving is a lot of times more deeper than that. Mm-hmm. That there's often a lot of emotional content to it, right? You can think of some technical things that you could solve where, given this input or given this state of where a customer is, we provide this, very well-defined fixed feature function service to them. But what you find is what you're often doing for them is making them relevant and important to, say, their boss in an organization. And it's like not looking dumb in front of their peers. It's like those type of things that you really do for them. And when you think of it at that level, that's where you really get that relevance for what you're doing. You're able to provide for them something that they can't get anywhere else, either at the price or in the model or in the method that you're delivering it to it. And that's when you've really keyed in on something that's important.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because most of the time, IBM is being a product manager at IBM, I think for the most part is more of like a B2B kind of, I guess, a product
Mm-hmm.
manager role. And a lot of other people looking to get into a product manager role, they usually look at B2C as the company, as the types of product management jobs that require you to think about the emotions of the customer. But, at the end of the day, even at a B2B company or B2B like software company, you're still selling to a person at the end of the day, and the person at the end of the day is still making the purchase decision or making the decision to continue to use a product or not.
Yeah.
So, you still have to think about their emotions. And one thing that you mentioned that I hear over and over again is the empathy, being able to understand the problems that your customers have and being able to understand what they need and want to help them through their day, like you're saying, to look good to their boss. And I think it was the IBM back in the day was the popular phrase where you don't get fired for purchasing IBM or something like that. Is that I think it was like you want to make sure that your customer at the end of the day is happy with their decision, regardless if it's a consumer or a business.
Yeah.
And to that end, do you spend a lot of time, or do your product manager spend a lot of time with the customer, or what is their how do they interact with the end customer?
Yeah. So just to go back to one point, you think about the difference between B2B and B2C, and I really believe that the only difference there is in who's paying the bill. That in B2B, the only difference is they're trying to justify an expense or a purchase, which is sometimes about money and sometimes about personal reputation and risk. But they're trying to justify it to somebody else, to making their boss happy. Mm-hmm. Other than that, all the emotions wrapped up into it, very similar. Not a lot of differences there. So we can get into the difference between the user persona and the buyer persona, but it's not like it's a completely different discipline or you're looking at it differently. But as far as the customer interaction, that's a really big part of being a product manager. Not so much from, say, just doing straight like user testing and seeing people use your product, which is important and a part of what you're doing, but it's also understanding kind of the context around what they're doing when they're using your product and really the problem that you're solving for them. So I spend a good chunk of my time, I would guess somewhere between 20 and 25% would be a good guess, right? About a day a week is a good average. It's sometimes lumpy, particularly when you kind of lump in going to like big conferences or meetups, where you'll spend an inordinate amount of time talking to a whole bunch of customers at once versus just doing like one-on-ones. But that's really, really key to what you're doing because really, again, the value that you bring here is understanding that customer and what they're dealing with. And depending on the market, those things change over time. The nature of the problems will change over time. What alternatives they have to solving those problems will change over time. The type of market that you're addressing will change as time goes along. And there's a lot of angles around how fast is that changing, and that kind of dictates, how much of this research you're going to have to do. But like I said, it becomes one of those things that it's a struggle in that you have to do it, and you can't stay relevant if you don't. But if you don't manage your time and you're not able to prioritize it, you can very quickly get caught up in the kind of nuts and bolts of what you're doing and become very inward focused, right? Focused on your own process and your own product and your own company. And if you find yourself doing that as a product manager, you're likely on the path of becoming irrelevant because you're not there as kind of the advocate for, look, this is really important to our customer. And when you look at things, a lot of the methodologies, and I'll talk to the Agile methodology because I'm somewhat familiar with it. The idea of having very crisp, well-defined personas. Like the first time you deal with like a well thought out persona, and you go in there and they have like a picture of some guy and he's got a name and they talk about where he went to school. You're like, well, this is silly, right? Because this is all manufactured. This isn't a real person. But you begin to think of them that way, right? And so when you kind of come to this decision that invariably you do, where it's not a clear choice, do we deliver this feature or this function, or do we delay it, or do we take an alternate course? You find yourself saying, Joe Smith is our persona. Would Joe like this decision or wouldn't he? And you have these like really silly debates about Joe and what Joe wants, but it kind of forces you to say, let's look at it from the side of our customers, right? And if we're making a decision that's good for us and bad for Joe, then maybe we need to back up and rethink this.
Right. That's definitely a great approach to think about just one person rather than a bunch of statistics and a whole mass of people. And
Yeah.
when you what you're saying, you spend about 1 day a week actually interacting and talking to customers, and I think that that's something that doesn't happen enough, and you hear that a lot now in the product manager space about how do you have to get out the office and not spend so
Mm-hmm.
much time
Yeah.
working in the business rather than working on it and finding ways to grow it and make it align with what your customers want and need. But what do you actually do once you go into the office? I think that that's an experience that a lot of new product managers or aspiring product managers are not. We don't get taught that. We don't really learn like what kind of questions to ask, like what to talk to customers about. Like, what's your goal when you go in, and how do you kind of accomplish your goals?
This is talking to customers.
Yeah, talking to customers.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a couple angles on this. If you don't know where to start, one of the best ways to deal with this is with however you do this, get involved with your support organization. Whether that means spending a day a week for the first couple of weeks or a month, just dealing with customer support. Go answer the phones. Go deal with the Zendesk queue. Go in there and solve their problems. And if best, meet with them. Spend time with them and understand why have you reached out to us? What is your problem? What isn't our product doing? And talking to them, and then get into so why is this important to you? Why is this? And sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes it's not. And those are always good questions to have. But you begin to feel that, build that experience and understanding of what's going on. It's always good to, like, as you said, get out of the office and actually go visit customers, and not just your customers, but maybe competitors' customers or other people that fit your market definition that haven't bought something yet or are using an alternative that they built themselves, or it's free, or it's cobbled together, right? Like invariably, every software solution that I've run into, there's somebody doing some version of it in a spreadsheet somewhere,
Hmm.
and really kind of talking to that person, like, okay, you have a problem that's so important, you're essentially building your own solution around, spending a lot of time doing that. Why? What are you doing, and why is this so important to you? And if you can really get to the base of those problems and understand what it is, that that's where the real insight and the magic comes from, because then you can turn around and be able to turn that into a requirement. And when you have a good list of requirements going, and you can be able to go out and test those, you can come back with some level of credibility to go into your business, and whether it's your product development organization, or your engineering organization, or some higher level to an executive, be able to come in and speak authoritatively about what's important to the market, and not do it in a way where it's debatable. I mean, that's one of the hardest things, right? You kind of go in there and you go, well, I think this is the most important thing to do. And depending on your standing in the organization, that may work and it may not. That may be an easy argument to knock down. But if you go in there and say, okay, I've talked to 200 customers, and 75% of them say this is their most important unmet need, that they would be willing to buy a solution for today. Nobody argues with that, right? Because
Yeah.
you've done the work. And there's an old adage I remember hearing from an executive that said, he who names customer wins argument.
Mm.
And it's, when you can bring the voice of the customer into that, decision process, that carries more weight than anything else, than any one person's individual opinion.
Yeah, that's definitely the one thing that I think has made my job as a product manager much easier, is to have data and to have the person that's putting the dollars down, the people that are paying for the products, to have
Mm-hmm.
their opinions and have their thoughts. And to just some degree, you're really just a conduit for them, and to have them, voice voice their opinions for them, to
Mm-hmm.
back to the organization. So we've covered, like, one day out of the week for you, which is working with and talking to and understanding the customers. Like, what else is your week made of? Like, what does your typical day to day look like?
Sure. So, it's one of those type jobs that, if you like to come in and do the same thing every day, this is not for you, because it's so varied, it's so different. Um, if you kind of lend yourself more to being kind of peripatetic and having to do something different all the time, then this is a very interesting job. And part of that is, you're really solving these very complicated problems, right? How do we bring this product or this solution to market in a time that makes sense, considering what our customers want, what we're able to deliver in the time frame allotted to us, with the amount of resources we have, and also considering what our competitors are doing and what may be going on in the market from a technology standpoint. I mean, those are a lot of different moving pieces to kind of keep track of. So it tends to lend itself as to be very complicated problems you're solving. And at the end of the day, if you're really taking charge of the product and really fulfilling everything that you can as a product manager, you're ultimately responsible for all of that. Even though probably most of the resources to accomplish that don't directly report to you. So there's an awful lot of work that's done between organizations, and typically product managers work a lot with development and engineering staff, a lot with sales and support, and then some with other parts of the organization, marketing, in marketing communications, if that's a separate part of the company, tied in with PR. Um, Other aspects of your delivery process, like legal, like finance, like pricing, putting together business cases, and those are not one of those things that you're constantly doing. You're either coming up with new ones or coming at it from a different angle, dealing with a new release or a new idea, and soliciting feedback and building consensus from the people who could potentially say no to what you're doing.
Yeah,
Um,
Yeah, I was going to ask, so you're saying how a job as a product manager it sounds like it's just a huge balancing act and you're not doing the same thing every day. Did you know that going in, or like what is something, I guess, what is the thing that most surprised you about the role before you got started that you didn't expect to run into?
So I didn't really appreciate from the outside looking in how much influence you can potentially have as a product manager. And again, my perspective here is somewhat skewed as having never worked in a startup or a small business, but having worked in largely enterprise most of my career. And there's from what I've seen, certainly with our customers and everything, there's this inverse correlation between the amount of assets and resources you have available and the amount of autonomy you have. At the very high end, you think of a company like IBM, um, we have a tremendous amount of resource available uh, from a sheer manpower standpoint, but also from the depth of technology and things like IBM Research, which is my entire product line came out of. Um, but then when you get to that level and you look at your business plan and there's a whole lot of zeros on the end of it, there's a lot more people who have to sign off on something like that. There's a lot of more people who have some slice of responsibility. And so it ends up being very much you're making your case to a pretty wide court around that. So building alliances and being able to negotiate through the different process elements of what you're doing becomes a big part of the role. And having to build a network like that and have credibility in a group, a fairly diverse group. Yeah, that was something I didn't appreciate coming
Mm.
into it.
Yeah,
How
that's
much you kind of had to really play, for lack of a better term, politician, but
politics.
not
Yeah,
necessarily in the negative sense, right?
right.
It's more, you really have to be able to convince people from very different backgrounds who have different incentives for how they support the business, that what you're doing is the right thing to do.
Yeah, it's definitely something I've heard before that the best product managers are also good politicians, and like you're saying, not in a negative kind of connotation that it has kind of gotten over in the recent past, but it's more about how do you show people that what you want to do or where you want to be is beneficial for them or beneficial for the
Yeah,
business. And do you have any tips on how to actually build a case like you're saying, or working for resources and getting people aligned with the same goals that you have?
sure. Yeah. So it's never easy and it's never straightforward and it's not the type of thing where it's step one, step two, step three. It always starts with having done your homework and really understanding your market. So again, being able to come in and say, I have done the research, I have talked to the market, this is what's going on. And not really just saying, well, I have an opinion that you may not think is very well informed, and so it's easy to say no to, but coming in with the facts, being able to make very fact-based decisions, and make the case around things in a very unassailable way, is a good start. The other thing is, much the way you have to build empathy for your customer is you have to build empathy for who you're dealing with inside, and understand that the way you see the business and the way you see the product is not the way they do, and that often, for very good reasons, they have different incentives. Someone who is, say, from part of the finance department, may alternately be very much incented around us attaining a revenue amount, and then conversely about containing costs to a certain level and making sure we meet goals. Sometimes those things align and sometimes they don't. Sometimes you find people that are very much about avoiding risk. And again, for a very good reason. You need people who are looking out for that. But they kind of care about one angle of this, but not really the other ones because of how you're organized or how you're incented. So being able to understand that there is a diverse set of requirements or concerns people have, and being able to address those individually, and not have to rely on fairly weak arguments about why they should listen to you, but really addressing their core concerns, right? Because much the way, that idea of the difference between B2B and B2C, everyone's job is ultimately to make their boss happy.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can understand what this person's trying to do to make their boss happy and align that with what you're doing, or change what you're doing in a way that it makes their boss happy but also achieves your goals, that greases an awful lot of skids.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think understanding like what's the core motivation for your end customer, it can really guide you in the right direction. And so once you have an idea of what you want to, what your customers' needs are, can you walk us through the product management process at IBM, and what's the development cycle like, and how the product manager fits into the process?
Sure, sure, yeah. I mean, typically, I'll describe very cleanly, from beginning to end, but it never works like that, right? Because you either come in midway through the process, or you've got three products that you're dealing with, and they're all at multiple phases. So it's not like you kind of get on the train at the beginning and ride it all the way through. It's
Yeah.
You jump on at some point, and that's difficult sometimes. But really, it kind of starts with a very clear articulation about what the market need is, and who you're solving it for. And you kind of get to this point of being able to build a case for, what are the jobs that we're being hired to go do? What pains are we solving for them? And what's potentially the gain that they get out of it? And you always kind of gear towards solving a pain, right? Because you have the old adage about, is your product an aspirin or a vitamin?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody quibbles over price for aspirin. They may look twice for vitamins, but man, when you got a headache, you want that thing to go away. And your price sensitivity
Right.
and maybe the objections that you have around it, those vanish very quickly.
Yeah.
So you kind of start at that level, understanding what that is. What is the thing that we need to do to go solve that? And then it's going back and looking at, like, what are we capable of doing? What technology do we have? What skills do we have? What relationships do we have in the market? So I'll give you an example in this case, specifically for Watson. We have now built, both through the Watson Initiative and the existing life science business in IBM, essentially the right to sell things in the healthcare market. We can sell solutions to largely institutions, but to the medical industry, and they will buy things from IBM. There are industries where IBM has no business selling anything. You can kind of think of like the consumer market, right? IBM would have a very hard time selling a consumer product, particularly since we no longer sell PCs anymore. When was the last time you as an individual bought something that had the IBM logo on it?
Yeah.
Probably, maybe never, right?
Yeah. Maybe a
So,
ThinkPad or something.
right, exactly. So that's one of those areas where it's kind of understanding, like, both from not just your channels, but when is somebody actually going to go, oh yeah, no, I know them and I would buy something from them because I probably bought something from you already. So being able to serve the market, making the market addressable, having essentially the right from the sense of the market standpoint, the ability to sell to them. So you kind of begin to like narrow things down here. And so once you kind of got the concept down, then you start getting into the nuts and bolts of actually product development and product delivery. And as a product manager, probably the most important thing you're doing here, from developing the roadmap as far as these are the discrete things we're going to do and when we're going to do them, is writing requirements. This is a hard skill for product managers. It's often a difficult one. It can be elusive, because if you're not an organization that's very well disciplined around this, they'll let you get by with really crappy requirements. Requirements that are non-specific in the language they use, right? Non-specific language about what, better or faster is, mm-hmm. right? The onus is
Not
on you is to define that. What does faster mean? I got to do this in less than 5 minutes. This type of UI should have a sub-second response time.
Hmm.
That's how specific you need to be in developing requirements, because you need to be able to hand something to your engineers to go build
Right.
that's that specific. This is what winning looks like. If you do this, we will win. And it can't be wishy-washy. You really got to be able to understand what you're doing at that level of granularity. So part of that discussion about going to customers and talking to them is kind of smoke testing that. Even before you put it in the roadmap, it kind of behooves you to go talk to developers and say, well, I have an idea here of what we might do. Let me describe it to you. I'm not asking you to do it, but let me describe the problem to you. Now, given that, do you think you could go build it, or what questions do you have, right? And then you start to get could we do it this way? Could we do it that way? If we use this technology and we deliver it this way, is that going to solve the problem? And either you'll be able to know enough about the problem to say, oh, yeah, no, here's the context and why that doesn't work or why it does work, or you've just got more questions to go ask the market, right? And this is the indication that you don't know it well enough yet. So it's really that's the hard part, and there's a lot to be said about the nuts and bolts of individual development processes, whether it's waterfall or Agile XP or all the different methodology. From a product management standpoint, it doesn't really matter.
Hmm.
It's, can I give them requirements on the front end, let them go build it, and then work with them on the back end about testing. Did we actually do this for the market? Did we do it in the time and the way that it's going to satisfy the needs for that problem? And are we
Right.
doing it in the concept of our overall strategy, that it makes sense of how we play in the market, why we win, and how we're differentiated from our competition and alternatives?
Hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a great overview. And so, if someone out there is looking to get their first product management job, or either they're right out of school, or maybe has worked in the technology kind of industry for a bit and wants to transition into a product manager role, what would you say are some key things that they should focus on to make them look like it, or to make them become a ideal candidate?
So, I mean, one thing you can do if you're in a company that has product managers is kind of do what you're doing here. Sit down and buy them a cup of coffee and say, "Tell me your story. What's it like? What are you dealing with? What problems are you dealing with right now? What's your headache?" And think through, how could you help that scenario?
Hmm.
Because for me as a hiring manager, one of the best interview techniques, once you kind of qualify, yes, you have the knowledge, yes, you have the skills, you have the attitude or the experience that we need. I'm going to bring you a problem that I'm dealing with, right? We're going to sit down and we're going to talk through something that I'm currently dealing with that I don't have a solution for. And if I present you a problem and you got nothing for me, yeah, okay, nice try, but probably you've just disqualified yourself.
Hmm.
If you kind of bring me a solution that the team has already come up with, that's a good sign, right? Like you sufficiently smart enough, sufficient understanding of what's going on, that you're running at pace with everyone else in the team. If you bring me something new and novel that we haven't thought of before, that looks like it's going to add value that no one on the team has come up with, you just got pushed to the front of the line on the whole thing. So really understanding where that team is sitting and what they're dealing with, and what new ideas can you bring to the table? Because this is very much a knowledge worker kind of cerebral type role, right? You got to
Hmm.
come in with your brain fully engaged in what you're doing, because as I described before, you're dealing with like very complex, fluid problems that you're trying to solve. They're not discrete. There's always multiple solutions for what you're doing, and very rarely is it obvious to any of this.
Yeah,
And
yeah, exactly.
yeah, that's where you add the value, because you got to come in and find the solution, and then not only find the right solution, but to convince a fairly broad set of stakeholders, both inside and outside your company, that this is the right move.
Yeah, and I think one of the great things about getting a job as a product manager or applying for a job as a product manager is that it's a meritocracy. You know, if you can prove they can do the job because there's no necessarily like a pedigree or like a school necessarily that you can go to
Hmm.
and just transition into a product manager job. I think a lot of the hiring that's done is really dependent on showing that you can do the job. And I like to always say to aspiring product managers that if you want to get the job, do the job before you get it, and
Yeah.
prove that you can do
Hmm.
it. And going along those lines, I think I hear a lot of product managers or companies that are hiring product managers suggest that side projects are really important, like being able to show
Yeah.
that you can build something. Like, what's your opinion on that? Like, how can like, what should a candidate do to in terms of a side project to really kind of wow you and blow you away when it comes time for
Yeah.
them to come in?
I mean, that's a great suggestion. And if you're working in a company that has product management, I will tell you, like any product manager that is sufficiently engaged in what they're doing has 10 or 15 things that they would love to do that they can't.
Hmm.
And if you can come in and solve that for them or help them with a side or a pet project they're working on, great place to start, right? Because you can kind of think of it as a very long interview. Um, Now, if you're not in a company, you don't have that type of relationship, or somebody's not going to be able to bring you in on what they're doing because you're outside. Actually, building a product and shipping something is key, and it doesn't matter what it is, right? It could be a blog as a product, but being able to talk about it that way and say, "I understand my market, and this is
Hmm.
why I made the decisions I did." And how I developed a solution to solve this specific problem for these type of people. That's a great example. So, I mean, Felix, look at what you're doing, right, with your program here. You're looking at solving a problem for a part of the market that is not served at all, where you have relatively new in their career folks, maybe just out of college or maybe just in their first job, and they're looking to get into this type role, and there really is no guide for them out there, and so this is an unmet need in the market, and you're providing a service here to help them with that, to bridge that gap. That's an excellent example of that,
Hmm.
and being able to understand why you do those things and what makes a good decision, and talking about what you struggled with and the difficult decisions you had to make. That's very much what that role is like. And even if it's relatively simple, or maybe even something that you're not even charging for, but you have a metric for what success is and can talk about things at that level, that really demonstrates a lot of the acumen that this role requires.
Yeah, and it sounds like, as you're talking about this, it sounds like a lot of product managers need to have that kind of entrepreneurial self-starter spirit in them where they can take an idea because a lot of people can come up with ideas. Ideas are, really easy to come up with, but then the hard part is how do you execute on it?
Mhm.
How do you, figure out what you should prioritize, what, you can wait on, and how do you, make it sustainable? I think that those are really all key, kind of traits that make a really good product
Mhm.
manager. And to kind of close this out, do you have any kind of someone came up to you and said that, hey, I want to apply for a job at IBM as a product manager. What kind of advice would you give them? What should they be focusing on? Let's say that if they have like a few months of preparation to put in, like what should
Sure.
they be focusing on?
Yeah, certainly do your homework. That's the base piece. Do the research. Do the Google research. Do the LinkedIn research. Understand who the players are. But then really get into the market. Understand what's going on in the market. Who are you serving? What are the problems they're dealing with? That really, really important. What are the general trends that's going on? And then take it to the next level. Right? Actually, go out and do some interviews. I will tell you, I'm floored when somebody comes in and says, I talk to people in the market who are dealing with this problem. Maybe they're existing customers or potential customers, but here's the insights that I've gleaned from talking to them. I'm actually coming to the table with a head start. Not that I know nothing about what you do,
Hmm.
but I've actually sat down and tried to figure out what the problems are, and try to, come to it with an idea about where we should think about going as an organization, where the product should be going, what are some different angles on this, and really looking for that like novel thought that's in there,
Yeah.
and certainly not rehashing ideas that are out there, but what's the next thing? Because again, the value of what you do is keeping your product relevant in the market, a year, 18 months from now. What's going to happen in the future? It's one of those funny things about product management, right? Because you could go to probably any organization and fire all the product managers, and nothing bad would happen right away. But eventually, what you would find is without somebody doing that role, you drive to obsolescence. You drive to commoditization of what you're doing, and you're just doing what everybody else is doing. And there's a lot of traps there. Even straight up listening to your customers can lead you in that path, right? Because if you fall into the trap of just saying, well, my job as product manager is to just take all the requirements that our customers give us and put them in order for development to go execute on, you're not doing your job. Because you're really not understanding the market. You're not understanding what's going on with competitors. You're not understanding how do you reach what in most markets is a fairly broad set of opportunity that is totally unaddressed by what you're doing. And if you just consider, your existing customers as a captive market and how you're going to continue to make them happy and, in a lot of cases just, milk the support money you're getting from them, you're not doing your job. You're not staying relevant to what's going on.
Right. Awesome. Thanks so much, Rich. Thanks for
Sure.
sharing your experience, especially from like a larger product management organization. If, the folks that are listening, if they want to kind of learn more about what you've been doing or how your career path and IBM specifically, or maybe they're interested in applying for jobs, what's the best way for them to stay in touch with you?
Sure. So I'm on LinkedIn. Rich Edwards Watson should get you there. Certainly take a look at if you're kind of interested in Watson and development in particular, ibm.com/Watson. And if you're interested in what I'm doing, particularly around Developer Cloud, it's ibm.com/Watson Developer Cloud.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rich.
Sure, Felix.